San Luis Obispo wasn't the kind of place that made headlines. It sat quietly between the hills and the sea, where mornings came wrapped in fog and evenings closed softly with the sound of crickets. Life moved slowly there, and that's just how the townspeople liked it. At the edge of town, behind an old nursery and a forgotten bookstore, stood a small building with shoji doors and wooden eaves stained by time. It wasn't flashy, didn't have a sign out front, and most people passed it without a second glance. But for those who knew, it was a place unlike any other. Inside, the floor was worn smooth from years of bare feet. Tatami mats lined the walls, and a single beam of light often slanted through the rice paper windows, catching the dust as it floated gently in the air. The space smelled of cedar and faint sandalwood, with the quiet hum of stillness that hung thick like the hush before a snowfall. Chuck Norris moved through the dojo like a whisper. He didn't shout, didn't lecture, and never raised his voice. Most days he said no more than a few words, but his silence carried the weight of someone who had already said everything that mattered. In the early mornings, before the sun had fully crested the hills, he unlocked the door and swept the floor with deliberate strokes. There was no rush in his movements, only rhythm. He lit a single stick of incense before a faded photograph tucked gently in the corner, bowed his head, and stood in stillness until the smoke thinned. His students arrived one by one, their shoes left neatly outside. No loud greetings, no chatter, just nods, small smiles, and the quiet exchange of presents. It was understood that words weren't necessary here. Tom was always first. A retired Marine, his gait was uneven, his breath shallow from years of desert air and surgeries. But in the dojo, he moved with surprising grace, as if something in the quiet loosened what the world had tightened. He never spoke about the war. He didn't have to. Chuck had once placed a hand on his shoulder after class and nodded. That was enough. Marissa came just after, carrying the tired weight of a widowed mother. She taught second grade by day and parented 2 boys alone by night. Here, she found space between those 2 lives, a kind of breath that didn't exist anywhere else. She often lingered after class, sitting cross-legged on the mat, sipping the warm tea Chuck placed beside her without a word. Then came Andrew, mid-40s, suit folded under his arm, the sharp lines of a man who'd lived too long in boardrooms and airports. His first weeks were filled with frustration. The stillness made him twitch. But slowly, the edge wore down, and one morning, after class, he bowed longer than usual. That was the day he stopped checking his phone between sessions. The sessions were simple, movements repeated until the body remembered. No drills, no belts, no loud claps, just form and breath. Chuck moved among them, correcting with a glance, a hand at the elbow, a soft repositioning of a foot. And always, when they bowed at the end, he bowed lower. He stayed after they left, always the last to leave. He refolded every mat, wiped the floor, and watered the 2 bonsai trees in the corner. Then he would sit for a while in the fading light, the room holding him like an old friend. No one knew much about his past. There were stories, of course. A few whispers about old movies, some martial arts trophies someone claimed to have seen once in a different town, but Chuck never mentioned any of it, and no one asked. It didn't feel right to. His strength wasn't in what he'd done, but in how he was. Calm, steady, quiet. Like an old oak tree that had weathered every storm and still stood, offering shade without asking for anything in return. Sometimes, on rainy days, he'd place an extra cushion near the window and sit with a student who stayed behind. They wouldn't talk much, maybe a sentence or 2, but the silence between them felt full, not empty, as if the quiet itself was teaching something too deep for words. There was a rhythm to that place, a stillness that softened whatever weight people carried in. You could feel it the moment you walked through the door, like the air changed somehow, slowed your heartbeat without asking. Chuck once helped Tom stretch after a long class. As he worked the tightness from the old soldier's back, Tom muttered that this was the first time in years he'd slept without nightmares. Chuck didn't answer. He just nodded and handed him a small towel for the sweat. Another night, Marissa left a note beside her teacup. It said, "Thank you for giving me a place to breathe." Chuck folded the note once, tucked it into a drawer, and said nothing. The photograph in the corner stayed untouched, save for the incense and the bow. No one knew who it was. A woman, maybe, or a fellow teacher from long ago. But when Chuck looked at it, something in his face softened. Not sad, exactly, just quiet. People in town started to talk, not in a gossiping way, but in that gentle way people do when something feels special. A man at the hardware store told his son, "If you ever feel lost, go find the old dojo behind the nursery. There's a man there who doesn't talk much, but he listens better than most folks ever will." And the boy went. And he stayed, not because Chuck asked him to, but because something in the silence wrapped around his own. There was no ceremony to it, no promotions or big achievements, just breath, movement, and quiet. But somehow that simplicity carried more weight than all the noise outside. Chuck never seemed in a hurry. He walked slowly, tended to things gently, and listened with his whole body. Even the birds that gathered in the garden seemed to settle more when he passed. Once, a new student asked if he could call him Master. Chuck shook his head and said, "Chuck is fine." That was all. And that was all it needed to be. It started with the sound of the bass. Deep, pulsing, thumping in a way that didn't belong on that quiet little street. The kind of sound that made birds take flight and old dogs lift their heads with a grunt. Chuck was sweeping the walkway outside when the truck pulled up. It was black, big and shiny, with tinted windows and cameras mounted on the hood. The side read, "Blaze Combat Crew" in red letters sharp enough to cut. 3 young men spilled out first, all in matching shirts and mirrored sunglasses. They laughed out loud, checking their gear, pointing at the dojo like it was a joke. Then the driver's door swung open and out stepped Jason Blaze. He wore tight black joggers, designer sneakers, and a sleeveless hoodie that barely covered the tattoos up his arms. His hair was spiked, his grin wide, and his energy came off him in waves like heat from asphalt. A camera followed close behind as he strutted up the path. "Is this the place?" He asked it like the building might answer. One of the crew called back, "This is it. The Ancient Arts Dojo or something. The whole thing looks like a tea house for ghosts." Chuck didn't pause his sweeping. He kept his eyes low, finishing the corner with slow, careful strokes. The sound of Jason's boots on gravel came closer, crunching with a rhythm too sharp for the peaceful afternoon. Jason stopped in front of him, arms crossed. "Are you the sensei here?" "Old school, huh? No sign, no merch. Do you even have a social media account or just a fax machine?" Chuck looked up and met his eyes. Then he nodded once. "Nothing else." Jason laughed. "You're Chuck Norris. Wait, for real? Not like a tribute guy? Man, I thought you were taller." One of the cameras clicked on, the red light blinking. Another crew member started circling, catching angles. Jason turned to face it, full on, voice rising. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Blaze Breakdowns. Today we're visiting yet another dinosaur dojo where the legendary Chuck Norris still teaches, what is this, Tai Chi for senior citizens?" He waved a hand around the quiet garden. "This is where martial arts came to die, folks. But don't worry, we're here to expose the truth." Chuck reached the end of his sweep and gently leaned the broom against the doorframe. He walked inside without a word, leaving the door open behind him. Jason raised an eyebrow, then grinned and followed. Inside, the dojo felt cooler, shaded by the afternoon light and the steady presence of stillness. The film crew hesitated at the entrance, whispering about light levels and acoustics. Jason didn't care. He stepped right onto the mat, shoes and all. "So here's the deal, Grandpa. I came to show my fans what happens when old myths meet real combat. You think you've got what it takes to face me in the ring? Or is this whole place just for breathing exercises and incense?" Chuck stood by the photograph in the corner, hands folded in front of him. The incense had burned down to a thin curl of ash. He looked at Jason, then walked over slowly and picked up a small tea tray. He poured one cup and held it out without speaking. Jason stared, unsure whether this was some kind of challenge or insult. He waved it off with a smirk. "Nah, man, I don't drink leaf water. Let's skip the ceremony and get to the point. You want to prove something? Step onto my mat. We'll film it. Show the world how real fighters move." Chuck didn't answer. He set the tea down beside the cushion near the window, then turned and walked to the center of the mat. His movements were quiet, but they filled the room with a weight that pulled everything into focus. Jason looked around, suddenly aware that his voice felt too loud in the space. But the camera kept rolling, and that was all he needed. "You afraid? Or is the silence part of the act?" Chuck finally spoke, his voice low and steady. "Come back at sunset. Alone." Jason blinked. "That's it? No speech? No defense of your art? No honor to uphold?" Chuck nodded once. Then he turned and began to sweep the mat with a wide, soft broom, as if the words had ended the conversation. Jason laughed, though something about it didn't sound as certain this time. He pointed to the camera. "Y'all heard him. Sunset showdown. No crew, just me and the ghost of Chuck Norris. This is going to be good." He turned to leave, tossing one last glance over his shoulder. "You got a few hours to stretch those joints, old man." The door closed behind them with a quiet thunk. The bass faded as the truck rumbled down the street, leaving only the rustle of leaves and the faint chirp of birds returning. Chuck finished sweeping, his motions as unhurried as before. He picked up the tea, now cooled, and drank it slowly by the window. The light was starting to shift. Outside, the town moved on like nothing had happened. A breeze stirred the trees. In the distance, a bell from the church tower rang once. Chuck placed the cup down, rinsed it in silence, and returned it to its shelf. No one else came by that afternoon. The dojo stayed quiet, wrapped again in the kind of stillness that makes people forget the noise ever happened. But inside, something had shifted. Not tension, not fear, just a slight change in air pressure, like the pause before a storm that might not be a storm at all, but something else entirely. The mat was swept, the incense is prepared. The sun moved lower in the sky. Then Chuck waited. By noon, the video was already climbing toward 1 million views. Jason Blaze stood in front of a mural in town, shadowboxing while one of his crew filmed from a low angle. His voice boomed through the speaker as he teased the coming showdown. "Old man Chuck thinks tradition can beat technique," he shouted. "Let's see how quiet works when fists fly." His followers flooded the comments with fire emojis, laughing faces, and cheers for blood. Across town, the dojo sat in its usual silence. Nothing had changed. Chuck moved through the garden with a rake in his hand, tending to the gravel paths like he had every day for years. He trimmed back a low pine, gathered fallen leaves into a small pile, and emptied the water basin near the stone lantern. A student arrived late in the afternoon, curious. Chuck said nothing, just pointed gently to the broom by the wall. "Sweep the courtyard." That was all. Tom stopped by with a thermos of coffee. He didn't ask questions, but stood for a long time watching Chuck arrange stones at the garden's edge. His hands moved slowly, as if placing each one into memory. Marissa came with her boys and left them in the car while she stepped in. She didn't speak either. She just looked around the room as if trying to memorize the way the lights slanted through the windows. Andrew was the last. He came in a pressed shirt and left work early. He asked, "Is it happening?" Chuck looked at him for a moment, then bowed once. By late afternoon, the dojo had emptied. The wind had picked up slightly, carrying the scent of pine and distant salt from the coast. Chuck walked the courtyard, scanning the ground with care. He stooped to remove a small twig, smoothed a patch of sand with his foot, then stood still for a long while. The sun drifted lower behind the hills. Long shadows stretched across the courtyard like slow fingers. Birds settled in the trees nearby, and the air took on that quiet weight that comes just before something important begins. At 6:42 the truck returned. This time there was no music, no laughter, just the sound of tires on gravel. Jason stepped out alone. He wore loose black pants and a dark hoodie, hood down. No crew, no camera in hand. But the phone in his pocket buzzed as messages poured in. He walked up to the gate and paused. For a second he seemed unsure, but then he pushed it open and entered the courtyard. Chuck was already waiting, sitting on the wooden bench near the garden. His hands were folded in his lap, eyes half closed. He opened them as Jason approached, slow and calm. Jason cleared his throat. "You ready? I brought a guy to film from the car. Just one camera, won't even come inside." Chuck stood and faced him. He didn't raise his voice. No filming. Not for them. Jason hesitated. "That's the whole reason I came. You know how many people are watching right now." Chuck looked at him. The silence that followed wasn't aggressive. It didn't push or argue. It just waited. After a long breath, Jason pulled his phone from his pocket and stared at the screen. He held it up, thumb hovering. He looked back at Chuck. "You're really not doing this for show?" Chuck shook his head once. Jason exhaled slowly and was unsure. Then he turned off the phone, slipped it into his bag and set it down beside the bench. "Fine. No cameras, no crew, just you and me." Chuck nodded, then gestured toward the open space in the courtyard. The light had shifted to gold now. Everything felt quieter than before, like the world had leaned in to listen. The courtyard was simple, swept clean. Flat stone tiles met sand in soft curves, and the edges were lined with moss and low-growing plants. The scent of warm pine hung in the air, mixed with the faint memory of incense. Jason stepped into the space and rolled his shoulders, more from habit than readiness. His breathing was quick but steady. Still, something in his eyes flickered. Maybe it was doubt. Maybe something else. Chuck followed behind him, slow and steady. He didn't bounce, didn't stretch, didn't pose. He moved like water settling into a bowl. They stood across from each other, two men, generations apart, shaped by different worlds. One had spent a life chasing silence, the other a career chasing noise. Neither spoke, not yet, not with words. And as the last edge of sunlight slipped behind the trees, they both stepped forward. Jason took the first step. Not slow, not cautious. He moved like he always had. Quick, sharp, with the confidence of a man who had trained to dominate. His feet hit the stone with purpose as he launched forward, testing the space, testing Chuck. Chuck didn't move, not until the very last second, when his body shifted like a reed in the wind. Just enough. Jason's hands sliced through empty air, and the momentum carried him one step too far. He adjusted fast, coming around with a low kick meant to sweep. Again Chuck stepped aside, not with force, but with a quiet grace that made the kick miss entirely. Jason's heel hit the stone, and his balance tilted. A breath later he was upright again, circling. His face had lost the smirk. He came in a second time, this time faster, jabs sharp and close together. But none of them landed. Chuck's hands didn't strike back, they guided, a soft touch on the wrist, a redirection at the elbow. Every contact is like a breath. Jason grunted and backed up. His chest rose with short, annoyed breaths. The courtyard stayed quiet. No one clapped, no one shouted, just the wind brushing through leaves and the faint crunch of Jason's footwork. Chuck stood still, calm and centered. Like he hadn't moved at all, Jason clenched his fists and came harder. This time with a feint, a turn, a spinning back fist that would have knocked someone cold. But again, Chuck turned just enough. Jason's strike hit the air and he stumbled past him. It kept going like that. Attack, miss, redirect, fall back. Jason's face grew red, sweat beaded at his temple, soaking into his hoodie. He shook out his hands and attacked again, this time leading with a low feint and rising into a knee. Chuck stepped into motion instead of away. His arm caught Jason's shoulder and turned him with it. The force of the strike dissolved, rolling away like water hitting stone. Jason dropped into a crouch and sprang up again. But by then, Chuck was gone. Not far, just out of range, always just out of range. By the fifth pass, Jason was breathing hard. His shoulders dropped between movements, his feet dragged half an inch more each time. He reached for a headlock that slipped right through Chuck's frame, like trying to catch wind. Chuck's hands never balled into fists. He never struck, never pushed. Only touched, guided, shifted. Each motion was quiet but final, like watching a door close slowly and then realizing you were already outside. Jason came in with a yell this time, voice loud, body wild. A spinning kick meant to break something. But halfway through the motion, Chuck stepped forward and raised a palm, not to block, just to show the space was already taken. Jason landed hard. His knee hit the stone, and for a second he stayed there. He looked up, chest heaving, eyes wide. Chuck didn't press. He waited. Jason stood again, slower now, fists loose at his sides. He came again, more out of habit than belief, a hook, sloppy with fatigue. Chuck stepped into it, turned his body, and Jason spun. Off balance. This time he landed on both hands and stayed there, staring at the ground. He didn't get up right away. The quiet settled over him. Around him the courtyard seemed to breathe. A pine branch swayed above his head. Gravel shifted softly beneath his palms. No one said anything. Chuck stepped back, giving space. His voice came low, steady. Want to try again? Or talk? Jason stayed still for a long time. His breathing slowed, then steadied. When he finally looked up, his face was different. Not bruised, not angry, just quiet. He nodded once, then again. His voice cracked when he answered. I'll talk. The wind moved again, soft through the garden walls. Chuck offered a hand. Jason didn't take it right away, but when he did, it wasn't for help standing. It was a kind of surrender, not to a person, but to a truth he didn't know he'd come looking for. Behind them, in the shadows of the open shoji doors, the students watched in stillness. No applause, no celebration, just awe. The fight had ended. Or maybe it had never really been a fight at all. Jason posted a 23-second clip the next morning. No intro, no voiceover, just a slow monotone reel of Chuck slipping past his kicks like smoke, calm as stone, ending with Jason panting and off balance. The caption read, "He never hit me once." His followers loved it. They called it a masterclass in defense, a rare show of humility. Views poured in, shares multiplied. But Jason didn't watch the numbers. He stared at the clip once, then closed his laptop and left the room. For days he felt like he'd walked out of something he couldn't quite name. Not a fight, not a loss, but something else had taken the floor out from under him without ever touching his chest. He tried filming a new video the way he used to, lights up, shirt off, talking trash. But the words felt hollow. His voice cracked halfway through the first take, and he stopped filming altogether. He walked more, left his car in the driveway and wandered the neighborhoods without reason. Sometimes he found himself at the gym, standing near the ring but not stepping inside. Other times he sat in coffee shops, watching people, listening in a way he hadn't before. He didn't know what he was listening for. It was just that the world sounded different now. Lith had something to say, like if he could get quiet enough to hear it. One evening, a plain envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper in slow, careful handwriting. Just a few lines. If you're still curious, the mat is open. No fee. Just show up. No signature. But it didn't need one. Jason folded it back, slipped it into his wallet and sat with it for a long time. He didn't tell anyone, not even his team. He packed a plain bag, left the cameras behind, and drove back to San Luis Obispo before sunrise. The dojo looked the same. Wooden gate, gravel path, still air. He stood outside for a long minute before walking in. Chuck was sweeping the courtyard. He didn't look up, just paused long enough to nod, then pointed to the broom by the door. Jason picked it up and began sweeping. No one made a fuss. No one asked for selfies or shouted his name. He was just another body in the room, barefoot, learning the basic forms from the start. He trained beside a boy who couldn't have been more than 9, and across from a grey-haired woman who moved with the calm focus of a surgeon. They all bowed the same way at the start and end. They all swept after class. The motions were simple, but never easy. Slow rolls, balanced steps, breathing at the right moment. Jason found his own thoughts louder than the class at first, but with time even those quieted down. He stopped posting videos. The team called. He said he needed space. They didn't understand, and that was fine. A week turned into a month. Then more. He found himself waking up early just to walk the path before class. He noticed things he never used to, the way the sunlight shifted across the mats. The scent of the incense was before it even reached the door. Chuck rarely said much, but when he corrected Jason's stance, it felt like a door opening. A lesson passed without being named. One afternoon, Jason watched a kid lose his balance during a form and fall. The boy blinked back tears, embarrassed. Jason didn't say a word. He just sat next to him, quiet, and waited. The boy stood back up on his own. The days blurred into rhythm, practice, tea, quiet. Then, one day after class, Jason walked past a middle school. 2 boys were squared off near the fence, fists clenched, yelling loud enough to draw a crowd. He didn't think, he just stepped between them. He didn't speak, didn't raise a hand. He just stood there, still and grounded. The boys stared at him. Their hands slowly dropped. One of them mumbled something under his breath, then turned and walked away. The other followed. Jason stood there a moment longer, then kept walking. That night he sat in his small apartment with the windows open. No TV, no music, just the sound of wind and traffic in the distance. He thought about how not long ago he would have filmed that moment, made it into a story, a lesson, a clip. But this time there was nothing to post. Only something deeper, something still, something growing. 3 months later, the lights were still off most of the day in the small building near the edge of town. The only sign out front read, "Redirection," in plain letters carved into old wood. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. Inside, the mats were always clean and the windows were always open. Kids sat in a quiet circle before class started, shoes tucked neatly by the door. There was no music, no trophies, no shouting. Jason moved through the space with quiet steps. His old posture, once sharp with energy, had softened. He still stood tall, but he didn't need to be the center of the room anymore. The old videos were gone, not hidden, gone. He had taken them down himself one morning, watched the screen go dark, and felt nothing but calm. His following vanished overnight, and that too felt like a release. He taught for free now. Kids came from every part of the city, some with noise still in their bones, some with silence already carved deep. He taught them how to move, how to breathe, and mostly, how to listen. One afternoon, a local journalist showed up. She was soft-spoken, wore glasses too big for her face, and seemed more curious than intrusive. She watched a class, then waited until the mats were clear before asking her question. "So did he beat you?" Jason smiled. He looked down at his hands for a moment, rubbed his thumb across a small scar on his knuckle, then looked back at her. "No, he just let me face myself." She nodded, scribbled something, then left without asking for more. That was enough. Later that evening, after the kids had gone, Jason sat on the bench by the wall. The air was still warm and the breeze slipped through the screen door in soft waves. He sat with his back straight, hands resting on his knees, watching the shadows stretch across the mat. The door creaked open once more. Chuck stepped in. He looked older than Jason remembered, but just as grounded. The same steady pace, the same quiet gravity that made the whole room feel still without him trying. He didn't speak, just walked over, looked at the students' photos pinned to the board near the shelf, and nodded once. Jason stood and waited. Chuck turned. He placed one hand gently on Jason's shoulder. His fingers pressed firmly, then eased. No words passed between them. Then Chuck stepped back, nodded again, and walked out. Jason stood at the door and watched him go. The street outside was quiet. The sky held that soft orange glow that only came in the last minutes of a good day. He didn't call out, didn't wave, just stood still, hands in his pockets, listening. Behind him, the dojo breathed. Not loud, not proud, just full.